Bridget Mitchell spotted Elizabeth Tandy walking into the post office, and quickly pulled Elizabeth's letters out to give the other woman. "How's business?" she asked, feeling tired. Elizabeth smiled. "Going really well these days. I left the baby at home with the nanny, and I'm out walking for an hour or two. I need to be back soon, because the baby is always so hungry." Bridget smiled at that. "He's a handsome boy. Takes after his father," Elizabeth said. "How's your father?" Bridget felt the tears welling up in her eyes. "Not well. The doctor doesn't expect him to last the month." "I'm so sorry." Elizabeth covered Bridget's hand with her own. "What will you do after he passes?" Elizabeth knew a great deal about Bridget's situation because the two women had talked often over the years when Elizabeth was either sending off letters for her business or receiving them. "I have no clue." Bridget wiped her eyes. "My father is allowed to live in the house we're in until his death, but after that, I don't even have a place to go." Elizabeth sighed. "I know you've thought my business was a little silly for years, but maybe you could consider becoming a mail-order bride? It would give you a place to go and a new purpose to your life." "I've thought about it more than once. Especially these past few days." Bridget rubbed the back of her neck nervously. "I know I'm easy to replace here. The post office had let her know they'd be happy to replace her if she needed to go once her father died. She'd thought she was important to at least her work, but apparently not. Well, if you decide that's how you want to handle things, you just let me know. I have a letter at home that's practically screaming your name. I know it would be the perfect situation for you." Cocking her head to one side to think about it, Bridget nodded. "I'll make sure I come over and talk to you about it the first chance I get." What Bridget left unsaid, but she knew Elizabeth understood, was that she would be over after her father died. All her life, Bridget and her father had been alone together. Her mother had died in childbirth when Bridget was just 2, and her father had never remarried. Her father was her life, and he always had been. The mere idea of losing him had left her in tears every night for weeks now, but she prayed he would go peacefully with little pain. That evening when Bridget got home from work, her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, met her outside. "I'm sorry, Bridget." Nothing more needed to be said as the kind older woman took Bridget into her arms and Bridget wept. How was she supposed to go on without the rock who had been at her side for every good moment of her life? After a short while, Bridget straightened and went into the house. She'd been slowly packing everything up so she wouldn't have to take care of the task while she was mourning her father, and she was able to pack the remaining things into 2 crates. Bridget and her father had long since sold their team of horses, so she put the boxes outside their small home. When she had finished, the pastor of her church was there, and they sat together and talked about the arrangements for her father's funeral, which they decided would take place on Sunday. 2 more days. After the pastor was gone, Bridget headed toward Elizabeth's house in the upper-class section of town. She knocked on the door, and Elizabeth's husband, Bernard Tandy, opened it to her. "I need to speak with Elizabeth, please." Bridget tried to keep her face expressionless as she asked for the matchmaker. "She's in her office," Mr. Tandy said. "Down the hall and the last door on the left." He opened the door wider for her. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Mitchell." "Thank you, Mr. Tandy." With that she walked down the hall and opened the last door on the left, where Elizabeth was sitting with the baby. "Elizabeth." Her words were soft, but Elizabeth heard and jumped to her feet. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Bridget." Elizabeth hurried across the room and opened her arms wide, allowing Bridget to cry a little more. "What can I do to help you?" Bridget knew she could ask to stay with the Tandys while she found a place of her own, but she refused to be a burden on anyone. "I would like to see that letter. I need to start over, and there's no better way than marrying a stranger." Bridget wasn't sure she meant what she said, but she would at least try to be positive. If she was going the route of marrying a man she'd never met, then she would do it with a good attitude. Elizabeth smiled and walked to her desk, flipping through the pile of papers there. "Sit down, Bridget. You look like you're about to fall over. You're staying for supper." Bridget did as she was told, sitting on the sofa that faced the desk. "Thank you." She couldn't argue, as she knew she wouldn't eat if she went home, and she was already far too skinny. At least that's what her father kept telling her. Of course, he'd never say that again. Elizabeth handed her the letter in question, and Bridget got quiet as she read it. "Dear Matchmaker, I'm a bachelor living in Montana, near Cauldron Valley. I have a ranch here, and it's going quite well, but I find that I spend most of my time alone. There are several men who work for me, but it's not the same as having a wife. I need someone who can cook and clean and doesn't mind sharing my bed. I've always wanted children, and I think it's just the right time to have a few. I'm 34 years old, and I don't want to spend even another year without a wife. Looks are not important to me. I just need someone willing to be my wife in every sense of the word. I've enclosed a bank order for her train fare and some spending money along the way, as well as paying your fee. You do not need to write back, as I would be thrilled to have her show up at any time. She'll ride the train right into Cauldron Valley and ask anyone where my spread is. Anyone in town can give her directions. Sincerely, Felix Potter." Reading over the letter once more, Bridget nodded. "Yeah, he'll do. I have to go to the post office to see when they can let me go, but the manager will be there in the morning, and he already knows my father died. I'm sure he'll just let me go. They've had someone waiting so I could take some time off after his death." "Do you need a place to stay until you leave?" Elizabeth asked. Bridget bit her lip. "I can probably stay where I am, but I don't know when the bank is going to come and take possession of the house." "Stay here. Please. It'll make me feel better about everything." Bridget nodded. "I can't thank you enough for your friendship, Elizabeth. I'm happy to do whatever I can. You know that." "I do. And it makes me feel better." Bridget stood. "I'll go home tonight and bring everything I'm taking over tomorrow." "That sounds good. And you're going at a beautiful time of year. I'm sure summer in the mountains of Montana is something to look forward to." "It is." Bridget took a deep breath. "Do you keep the letter, or do I?" "I keep it for my records." "All right. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks again." Bridget left the beautiful home her friend lived in, still feeling deep sorrow within her. It would be a while before she would stop thinking of her father all the time, and she certainly hoped Felix was all right with that. He'd have to be. Asterisk. Elizabeth stood beside Bridget at the funeral 2 days later. The post office had already hired someone to replace her, so all she had to do was get on a train the next morning. It seemed so odd to leave behind everyone she'd ever known, but it felt freeing as well. She dropped a handful of dirt on her father's grave with tears streaming down her cheeks, and she whispered, "Goodbye, Papa. I'll never stop loving you." As she got to her feet, Elizabeth took her arm and stood with her as all the mourners passed by to shake her hand. Bridget was suddenly glad to be leaving. Maybe it was strange to feel so excited by it, but she'd just watched the most important person in her entire world be lowered into the ground. It was time she got a new important person. After the long stream of mourners had passed, Elizabeth and Bridget went back to the mansion on Rock Creek Road. There, they had supper with Bernard, and then the two of them stayed up late, discussing what a man would expect of his bride. "He sounds like he needs you mainly for cooking and cleaning, but he's also looking for companionship in the bedroom. Do you know what that means?" Elizabeth knew that Bridget was her age, but so many parents hid what happened between a man and woman in the bedroom from their young daughters. Bridget blushed, but nodded. "My father had a neighbor woman explain it to me so I wouldn't be confused." "Your father was an amazing man. He'll be missed by so many people. He will. I wish I could see him just one last time, but I know I said everything before he died. Bridget shook her head. And he's with my mother now. And the son they shared who never drew breath. I'm sure he's so much happier than he was with me. Selfishly, I want him back, but he's done all he needs to do with me. Now it's time for him to be with the rest of the family again. And he did such a good job raising you without a mother. He really fulfilled his obligations here. Elizabeth smiled. I'm going to miss your smiling face every time I go to the post office. You have to write to me. Bridget smiled. Of course, I will. I even know your address without having to look. Write me as soon as you arrive in Montana, and then let me know how things are going there. I'll be worried until I hear from you. I'll write as often as I can. Bridget had a couple of other friends to write to, but Elizabeth had been in her life more than the others. I think it's good that I'm getting a fresh start. No one there will know me at all. I won't be the motherless girl or the one whose father recently died. That's true. I'm sure you'll love Montana. It just sounds beautiful. I've seen some photographs of it there. I really can't wait to see it in person. And there's a train station in his town. It'll be amazing to not have to travel very far once the train ride is over. I've seen people who spent a week on a train and then had to travel for days in a stagecoach. Your trip will be much better than that. I do hope so. It will be strange to arrive in a town looking for the man I'm supposed to marry. Bridget shook her head. How odd to travel across the country with the intent of marrying a stranger. Of course, it will, but you can do it. Elizabeth smiled. The train to Chicago leaves at 10 tomorrow morning. You need to be on it, so we need to get some sleep. I had no idea it was so late. And I have a feeling I'll be living very different hours when I'm married. I hear ranchers are up with the roosters. Hopefully not before the roosters, Elizabeth said. My least favorite thing about living as a farmer's daughter were the early hours. I still tend to be up early, but nothing like I had to be back then. I've never had to be up super early. My father always worked for the bank in town, which is why they let him keep the house until his death. Bridget sighed. But I'll say goodnight. I'm not looking forward to the early mornings at all. Well, I'll say a prayer that they aren't too early. Elizabeth got to her feet and headed for her office door. I'll see you in the morning before you go. I'm really doing this. Right? Elizabeth laughed. Right. You're going to be happy. Asterisk. The trip west seemed to take forever to Bridget. The train was crowded, and she had a man across from her who kept spitting into a tin cup. Then he'd get up, dump out the cup, and start all over again. He got onto the train in Minnesota, and it seemed he would never get off. It turned her stomach a little to watch it. When it was finally her stop, she was happy to leave the man to his spitting as she got off the train. Cauldron Valley didn't look like a huge cauldron, which is what she'd really expected. There was a mercantile right next to the train station, so she went there to inquire about Mr. Felix Potter. She waited patiently as the man behind the counter helped someone else, and then she stepped forward. I'm looking for Mr. Potter. Felix? The man asked. Yes, sir. Felix Potter. The man smiled. He's at the back of the store. He keeps hoping a bride will come to him, and he buys her a new gift every day. Bridget swallowed hard. I'm his bride. The man behind the counter yelled, Hey, Felix. I found your little bride. A man at the back of the store hurried forward, looking a bit anxious. You my bride? He asked. Bridget nodded, happy to note he wasn't carrying a cup to spit into. I'm Bridget Mitchell. Elizabeth Tandy sent me. Well, I'll be. I figured any bride coming this far west to marry a stranger would be as ugly as a toad. You're pretty. Mr. Potter seemed to be downright thrilled at her appearance. Bridget swallowed hard. Thank you. As she stood there with a carpet bag in each hand, she wished he'd offer to take one from her, but he stared at her, dumbfounded. It was a long journey. Hopefully, her hint would work. Felix jumped at her words. Let me take those from you. We'll go see the preacher right now. He nodded at the merchant there. Thanks for finding her for me, Frank. She sort of found me, Frank responded, his eyes twinkling. Felix offered her his arm as he walked out to his wagon and offered to help her inside. Bridget, is it? Bridget nodded. It is. She looked all around the valley from her vantage point of the wagon seat. What made you come all this way to marry a stranger then? My father died, and all my connections to Massachusetts died right with him. My friend Elizabeth is the matchmaker who runs the mail-order bride business, and she asked me if I'd be willing to come west. I read your letter, and I agreed. It was that simple. Felix was silent for a moment as he put her bags in the back of the wagon and climbed onto the wagon seat beside her. I'm very sorry for your loss. But he wasn't. If her loss is what got her to Montana and beside him on his wagon, then he was glad she'd lost her father. Chapter 2. Felix drove through town toward the little church that he'd attended since he'd come to Montana. The preacher man is really nice. He's a cauldron. This here valley was named after his family. Name is James Cauldron. He came here on a wagon train as a boy, and his family settled here in the valley. They have one of the biggest operations around. Great ranchers. Bridget nodded. It sounds like he has lots of ties here. Oh, he does. His family is real well known around here. I have heard stories that he was really wild when he was a boy. He has a twin brother, and they got into all kinds of ruckus when they were young. I see. Bridget wasn't sure why she needed to know that the preacher was a twin or that he'd been wild as a young boy, but she'd listen if he needed to tell her. You have a family? He asked, glancing over at her nervously. Felix hadn't expected to be half as nervous as he was when his bride got there, but some things were just unexpected. Really, he'd expected to marry an ugly woman and put her out of her spinsterish misery, but instead, he was marrying a pretty woman. How was he supposed to react to something like that just being thrown at him? Not anymore, she said softly. My mother died giving birth to a little boy when I was 2, and as I told you, my father died just about 10 days ago. I'm alone now. He frowned. Actually, you were alone until today, and now you're not. He covered her hand with his after stopping the wagon in front of a small house beside the church. Mrs. Cauldron will surely welcome us with open arms. They're a nice couple. All their kids have grown up and moved out, but they stay on here, taking care of their flock. I look forward to meeting them, she said softly. She'd brought all of her clothes, and only one dress was nice enough to be married in, but it looked like her groom would be wearing his work clothes, so it didn't really matter if she wasn't in her best. He helped her down from the wagon, and she was pleased to see he seemed to have found his manners after leaving her holding her own bags for so long, and they walked to the front door. He knocked loudly, and she stood looking at the ground, feeling so strange. Marrying a stranger. What was she thinking? The door was answered by a woman in her 50s, with her gray hair in a bun atop her head. She looked stern until you really looked at her eyes, and then you knew better. Felix. Welcome. Did your bride finally make it here from out east? Obviously, the man had told everyone he knew that he had a bride coming. Felix nodded. This is Bridget Mitchell, and I'm hoping the preacher is home and willing to marry us this afternoon. Mrs. Cauldron smiled and nodded. He is home. We've been expecting you to come with a bride sooner or later. Bridget looked at Felix as Mrs. Cauldron went to fetch her husband. Did you tell everyone in town you were expecting a mail-order bride? He shrugged. I guess I did. Is that wrong? She sighed. I guess not. It's just, well, it's not what I expected. She was usually a private person, but Felix obviously told his business to everyone around. It was strange to her. Her father had been very private as well. You'll get used to me. I'm sure it won't even take you long. She smiled and nodded, not sure what else to say. He was a handsome man, but he was so open about everything. It felt strange to be with him. If she told him she was on her monthly, would he announce it to the world? The pastor came to the door and opened it wide. Welcome. You must be the bride Felix sent off for. She's a beauty, Felix. She is, isn't she? Sure isn't as ugly as a toad like I expected her to be. The pastor laughed at his words, and Bridget started to see that perhaps the man was accepted for who he was in this town. I'm happy that no one needs to cover their eyes and run away screaming. Both men laughed together. You have one with a sense of humor here, Felix. You're going to be thankful for that. He motioned them both in. Come in. Come in. We need to have a wedding. Bridget stepped inside, wanting to ask if there was another man she could marry, but she knew it would hurt Felix's feelings. The man seemed like he was a bit sensitive, but she really couldn't tell on just a few minutes' acquaintance. The ceremony went quickly, and when Pastor Cauldron told Felix he could kiss his bride, Felix rubbed the palms of his hands on his work pants before reaching for her. He pulled her to him, and his kiss was a bit wet and a little too aggressive for the preacher and his wife. Bridget stepped back as soon as she could, wishing she knew what the day held for her. She could only hope he would understand she'd need a day or two to settle in. Hopefully, she could tell him she didn't want to make love just yet, and he'd be all right with that. They thanked the pastor and his wife for marrying them, and after helping Bridget into the wagon, he headed straight back to the mercantile. I don't have much around in the way of food. I eat a lot of beans and jerky, he said, shrugging. So, you'd like me to pick out what we need for me to cook with, she asked. Yes, please. I sure hope you're a good cook. I've cooked for my father since I was a girl. I don't know if I'd say I'm good, but I'm definitely adequate. Many people had called her a good cook over the years, but Bridget had been raised not to toot her own horn, so she wasn't about to brag about it. What do you like to eat? He shrugged. Meat and potatoes tend to be my favorites. And lots of them. Bridget smiled, hoping it was early enough in the year for her to put in a kitchen garden. She knew it was in Massachusetts, and she had, but here in Montana, she was certain the growing seasons would be different. She wandered through the aisles, choosing what she would need to bake bread and sweets as well as bacon, ham, and beef roasts to feed her hungry husband. And potatoes, both for planting and for eating. Husband. How strange it felt to look at the cowboy in front of her and think of him as her husband. She had to wonder if he even owned a suit. He'd married in his work pants, and he hadn't had a single qualm over it. When she'd finished choosing everything she thought she'd need for their first week or two as man and wife, he paid for it all and it was loaded into the wagon. Do you drive? He asked. She shook her head. No, we lived in a small town and I walked most everywhere. I see. Well, you're going to need to be able to drive out here. I can hitch the team up for you and even unhitch it, but you'll need to be able to get into town to buy supplies for yourself. I see. It hadn't occurred to her that she would need such a thing. Her father had talked about teaching her to drive, but then he'd grown ill, and they'd had to sell the horses. I guess you'll have to teach me. He nodded. I will too. Have you ever milked a cow? Oh, yes, of course. I lived in town, but we had a milk cow and several chickens. Good. I'll milk the cow usually while you cook breakfast, but there may be times you'll need to, and I like to know that you know how at least. They drove for more than 10 minutes out of town before he pulled off to a small house. Well, she wasn't sure it was even big enough to call it a house. Maybe a cabin would be a better word for it. Either way, it would do. It was a little bigger than the home she'd shared with her father, so she didn't mind even one bit. Next to the cabin was a large, cleared area, and she could see that someone was building something bigger and better there. "Are you building a new house?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm sorry you'll have to live in the old one for a while, but the new one will be much nicer. You'll have to tell me about it after you show me our house." He shrugged. "There's not a lot to show. It's basically just one big room. You won't have too much to clean, though." The man seemed to be constantly cheerful, which was a bit of a surprise to Bridget. "That will be nice." She walked into the house while he unloaded the wagon and brought things in, showing herself around. There was a big bed on one side of the cabin, and a kitchen area with a fireplace and a stove on the other end. He had no running water, but that was fine with Bridget. Except for the few nights she'd spent with Elizabeth, she had never stayed in a place with running water. When Felix brought in her carpet bags, she asked, "How far is it to the well?" "Oh, it's about 50 yards, he said, pointing out toward the back. "Would you mind showing me? I'll need water to be able to fix supper." "Oh, sure. I'd be happy to show you. I sure hope you're going to like it here." Bridget smiled, realizing that the man's excitement seemed to be rubbing off on her. "I am sure I will. Now, let's go look at the well so I can start supper, and we can eat at a decent hour." He offered her his arm, and she smiled to herself as she took it. "The land is so beautiful here." "It sure is. I lived in New York City until I was 21 and old enough to get some of the free land Uncle Sam was offering. I truly love this place. My folks are back in New York, and I think my ma is still waiting for me to come home to her, but it's not going to happen. I love it here way too much. There's even a hot spring in town, though the people who own that property don't let anyone use it." He stopped walking. "Here's the well." She glanced back at the house. It would be hard in winter, but then she could just melt the snow and get the water she needed. "This isn't bad at all. I'm going to get a bucket and take it in with me." "What are you cooking?" he asked, seeming as excited about having her cook for him as he was to see her there. "I'm not sure yet. Besides, I want to surprise you." He grinned. "I like being surprised." It was already well after noon, and she knew she wouldn't have time to make anything elaborate, but she could shave a little bit of the beef off the roast she was planning for the following night, and it would be easy enough to turn into a gravy to eat over the potatoes she'd boil and mash. It wasn't a fancy meal by any chance, but it was a far cry better than what he'd been eating before her arrival. He carried the water back for her and set the pail down on the table. "I have a cellar for keeping the meat cold. When the new house is built, we'll get an icebox like the fancy people have." "An icebox would be wonderful." He smiled, a huge smile that lit up his face. "I'm going to go and tell my men that my wife is here, and I won't be eating with them tonight, and then I'll milk the cow." She nodded and walked to the table, where she dug through the crates of food he'd brought in and found the meat. As soon as she saw him ride off, she hurried out to the outhouse she'd spotted and took care of business. She hoped she wouldn't be too shy to tell him she needed to relieve herself for long, because it hurt to hold it for such extended periods of time. Then she went back into the house and used the bucket to wash her hands. She'd get another for the cooking she planned to do. When he came in after milking the cow, it was an hour later, and she had supper just about done. "Give me a minute to mash the potatoes, and everything will be ready." His eyes were excited as he went to the bucket and washed his hands. "Whatever it is, it smells delicious. I didn't have time to make anything fancy, so I just threw a few things together. It should taste good, though. I'm just happy not to have to eat another can of beans." She laughed. Not tonight, though I'm sure we'll eat beans from time to time. When she put everything on the table, he sat down at one end, and she sat perpendicular to him. I just trimmed a bit off the beef I planned to serve tomorrow and cooked it into a gravy to serve over mashed potatoes. As I said, nothing fancy, but it should taste really good. Do you need me to take the meat down to the cellar? He asked. She shook her head. No, I already took care of that. Oh, good. I was hoping you found your way down all right. I did. He took her hand then, praying. He thanked God for bringing a beautiful woman into his life and for the meal she'd cooked for them. She had never felt so wanted in her life as she did listening to his prayer. The man seemed just a bit odd to her, but she couldn't complain. He was so happy for her to be there. He took his first bite of the food and closed his eyes to savor the taste. You lied to me. Bridget's eyes widened. I didn't. You said you weren't a good cook. This meal is wonderful. She laughed softly. Tomorrow I'll have time to bake bread. That will be really nice. I'd ask you to marry me if you weren't already my wife. She laughed again, but she had to wonder if she'd have said yes if she'd met him before traveling all that way to meet him. Chapter 3. After supper, Bridget washed the dishes while Felix sat at the table and talked to her. He talked about his decision to claim property as soon as he turned 21, and about how hard the first few years of trying to run a ranch were. How long ago did you come here? She asked. 13 years. It took the first 5 to even remove enough trees for the cattle to be able to wander freely. During my 6th year, I hired on my first ranch hand. I've hired 8 more since, so there are now 10 men working this property, including me. Felix shook his head. Of course, for the last month it's been 9 men, because I've spent every day in town hoping you'd come in on the train. Bridget smiled. I'm happy you were excited about my arrival. She finished the last of the dishes and put them away. She would spend time rearranging the kitchen the next day while he worked, but for now, things would stay the same. She walked to the table to sit beside him. I need to write my friend Elizabeth a letter tonight, so she'll know I've arrived safely, and all is well. What other duties do you have for me? He shrugged. Mostly normal woman stuff. I have torn a lot of my shirts, so if you're a good seamstress, that would help me a lot. I have clothes that need to be mended, but many that just need to be replaced. The house needs a good scrubbing, but I don't think that will take you long. Bridget looked around. The house had dirt on the floors, and everything was dusty, but it truly would only take her a couple of hours to get through all that based on the size of the house. You're right. That'll be quick. How's your laundry situation? She'd looked around but hadn't noticed any laundry yet. It's bad. It is? She looked around the house again. It wasn't big enough to hide much. Well, there's nowhere to put it, so I shove it under the bed. Under the bed? Bridget had never heard of such a thing, but she was willing to take care of it. Perhaps she could make a laundry sack out of flour sacks, and they could put laundry into that. Yes, of course. I didn't know where else to put it and not have the house look messy. So tomorrow you'd like me to do the laundry and clean the house? Am I right about that? Bridget truly wanted to guarantee his agenda was her own. He nodded. Look at the clothes as you wash them. I think you can use the old shirts for patterns to make the new ones. All right. Felix was thin and wiry, and she had a feeling that would change judging by the way he'd eaten that night. She would use his old shirts for patterns, but she would make them a little bigger all around. Given several good meals, the man would definitely need more room in his clothes. Bridget got to her feet and looked out one of the 2 windows in the little house. Where is our nearest neighbor? She asked. Oh, the Cauldrons. James's twin, John. He and his wife live at their ranch. It's just a mile from here on the road, but away from town. I could find that. They're an older couple? She asked. He nodded. Yup. Their twin sons and their wives and children live there with them. For some reason, that family always has twins. I think it would be terribly unlucky if they had triplets, so we all kinda pray they don't. Bridget couldn't imagine why triplets would be considered bad luck, but she wasn't about to argue with him. Pastor Cauldron has a service every Sunday? She asked. At Felix's nod, she continued. I hope you go to church every week, because I certainly plan to. I think that would be great, he said softly. I usually go. Good. Bridget felt his eyes on her as she walked around the small cabin, looking at things that needed to be cleaned. Someone had hung curtains, and she had a strong feeling it wasn't Felix, and they desperately needed a good washing. Judging by the quilt on the bed, all his bedding should get a good scrubbing. Tell me about the community? Are people warm and giving? Some of the people in Beckham had been that way, but the majority were not. It was a strange way to live. Most are. It's really a little country town, and everyone does their best to help their neighbors. When it's time to drive the cattle to market, the different ranchers usually get together and drive them as one big group. It's much safer than each rancher going it alone. That's great. It sounds like just the kind of community I've always wanted to be a part of. Felix smiled. I'm really glad you're here. He held out a hand for her, and she took a deep breath and went to him, unsure of exactly what he wanted to do. It was their wedding night, and he had every right to want to consummate the marriage, but she wasn't sure she was ready for anything quite so intimate yet. I am too. It was a long journey. Bridget put her hand into his and was surprised as he pulled her into his lap. Oh. This is where you belong, sweetheart. I've been waiting for so long for you to arrive, and it seems like I've known you forever. He buried his face against her neck, and Bridget felt odd. Why was he touching her this way? Did she dare tell him that she wanted him to stop? After a moment, she decided that she would always regret it if she didn't tell him. I'm not sure I'm ready to consummate our marriage tonight. Can we take a little time to get to know one another? Bridget blushed as she asked, but she had to be honest about what she needed from him. If she gave in to all of his needs today, what would the future hold for them? He sighed. If you were ugly as a toad, would you be willing to do it tonight? As he waited for her answer, he wondered if he would be as desperate to make love with her if she were as ugly as a toad. She looked at him for a moment and sighed. I really don't think I would, even if I was as ugly as a toad. Though I do think you might be obsessed with women who are as ugly as toads. Maybe I am. He took a deep breath. You're right, of course. I never should have expected it the night you arrived, but you got here and you're so beautiful that I was sure everything was going my way. I thought Lady Luck looked down upon me and smiled. I can't say that she didn't, but I would like time. Wishing he'd given her some kind of indication how he felt about a little more time, she waited for Felix to answer. How much time? He asked. A week or two, she suggested. Felix frowned. That's too long. A day? That's not enough time for me to feel like I know you. 5 days, she asked, hoping he'd agree. Anything less, and she'd feel like she was selling her favors like a saloon girl. He tilted his head to one side, looking at her. Is it really important to you? It is. At that moment, nothing was more important. Then we'll wait 5 days. I might die, but I'll do my best to make it through those long, long nights. Bridget couldn't help but giggle. You're silly, Felix. He shrugged. Always have been, I guess. He didn't mind that she thought he was silly. It meant that he made her laugh, and that had to be a good thing. Wasn't humor an important part of romance? He would like to think of their love as a romantic comedy, and he would provide whatever comedy she needed along the way. Bridget pressed a kiss to his cheek. Thank you for giving me the time I need. I feel like it's something you need, or you wouldn't have asked, so even if I wish it was otherwise, I'll survive. I'm so happy to hear it. She smiled at him. Tell me about your family? She moved to sit on a chair near him where she could watch his face as he spoke to her. Well, I told you I was raised in New York City. I have 5 brothers and 1 sister. We all lived in a small house there. I started working when I was 10. I delivered for a store in town, and then I started driving a hack for the wealthy who wanted to be part of the social scene in Manhattan in the evenings. I'm the oldest. My sister is married, and 2 of my brothers are married. I have 1 niece and 7 nephews. I'm not sure why my family has so many boys, but hopefully you'll have some daughters. I'd like that. Do you want a lot of children? She asked. She was already older than most women when they married, so she hoped she could have several children yet. I'm thinking 15 or 20, if that's not too many for you. She stared at him for a moment, hoping he was joking. Did he even know what childbirth did to a woman's body? I think that may be too many for me. He laughed. I'd like 3 or 4. It would be nice to have some sons, but at least 1 daughter for you. She sighed, relieved. That sounds just about right. Felix grinned at her. Any more than that, and I'd be too old to enjoy them. I'm not so sure about that. Bridget got to her feet. I know it's still early, but I've been traveling across the country for days and watching men spit into tin cups. She shuddered. I need to get some sleep. I'm sure you do. He stood up and wrapped his arms around her. Is it all right if I kiss you on occasion as we get to know one another? She blushed again, but nodded. I think that would be a good way for us to get more comfortable with one another. So do I. With those words, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. His hand stroked up and down her back. I hope you sleep well. I'm up just before dawn to start on the morning chores. I'll wake you when I get up. She nodded, looking around. She didn't know how she would change with him right there in the room. She and her father had a curtain they pulled at nighttime. He watched her for a second, and then seemed to understand. Why don't I go for a walk while you get ready for bed? She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. Thank you, Felix. That would make me a lot more comfortable. She hadn't thought about this part of marriage and how uncomfortable it would be. She was glad he understood. As soon as he left, she quickly removed her dress and put on her nightgown. It was white, and she hated how thin it was, but it certainly wouldn't be good to wear in the summer if it was thicker. She had a thicker nightgown for the winter months. She looked at the bed, thinking about how small it would be for the 2 of them. They would be getting to know each other very quickly with the space they had available. She climbed into bed and closed her eyes, not bothering to turn down the lantern. She knew he would do that as soon as he arrived back at the cabin. She was asleep before he got back to her, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at how lovely she was in her sleep. Almost angelic. How he'd gotten so lucky as to marry a woman who was as beautiful as she was, Felix didn't know. But he would cherish her for as long as he had her by his side. She seemed to be exactly the woman he had needed in his life. He only hoped he was the man she needed. Only time would tell. He sat at the table and read some of the novel he'd been working on, but he couldn't stay focused on it. His mind was constantly on the woman asleep just a few feet from him, and he couldn't stop looking at her. He couldn't believe she was his wife. People had laughed at him when he'd sent away for a mail-order bride, but no one would be laughing when they saw her at church on Sunday. He really hadn't cared if the woman who came was beautiful as long as she knew how to do the work he needed a wife to do. But here she was, able to do whatever he needed done, and she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He remembered some women who dressed all fancy-like back in New York City, when he'd driven them around in the evenings. But not one of them could hold a candle to her. His wife was so much more than anyone had expected, including him. She was smart, funny, and just a good person from what he could see. He very much wished that she'd come to him 5 years before, but she wasn't ready then. Now that she was, they'd take care of everything together. Chapter 4. Bridget woke early the next morning to see that Felix was already up. She wasn't sure he'd even slept beside her until she saw the indentation from his head on the pillow beside hers. She jumped up and immediately changed into a day dress, but thankfully not the one she'd worn all across the county. This one was clean. She had just started eggs and bacon for breakfast when she heard the door open, and Felix brought her a bucket of milk along with a basket of eggs. "I don't mind gathering the eggs if that makes your mornings easier," she told him. Felix stood at the table for a moment, just watching her work. She was so efficient in the kitchen, he could tell she'd been cooking for years. "Any morning I'm in a hurry, I'll leave them for you." He set the eggs and milk on the work table, and walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, and resting his cheek against the top of her head. "How did you sleep?" "Very well. I woke up a few minutes ago, and I didn't even know if you'd slept beside me. Thanks for leaving a lamp lit for me." It was before dawn, but she could see that the sun was creeping up over the mountains off in the distance. This truly must be the most beautiful place on all of God's earth. "No problem. I always light one when I wake, but I lit another and left that one for you in case you woke up before I got back. I was worried I'd have to wake you and force you to feed me." She laughed. "I tend to wake early, though I could have slept much later today. The journey has left me a great deal more exhausted than I expected to be." "I can imagine it would. You traveled across the county so quickly. I remember when I rode the train out west. We didn't have our train station here yet, so I had to buy a couple of horses and drive over from Helena." "Is Helena far from here?" She'd at least heard of Helena, Montana, though before his letter, she'd never imagined there was a place called Cauldron Valley. "You could get there in a day by horse and buggy, but it would be a hard ride. By train, it's only about an hour and a half from here." "That's not far at all. What is Helena like?" He shrugged. "It's the biggest town in this part of Montana. I guess if you like cities, it's all right. I'm not exactly partial to them, or I'd have stayed back in New York. There's over 10,000 people in Helena, and that's too many for me." She scooped the eggs out of the pan and put them onto 2 plates that she'd already added bacon to. "I'm not sure what you like to eat for breakfast, but I went with eggs and bacon this morning. When I wake a little earlier, I can add some hash browns into the mix." He'd said he liked potatoes, and she'd be happy to fill every meal with them if that's what he wanted. As his wife, it was her job to please him. "I like all the breakfast foods. If you can find one I don't like, I will be surprised." It took everything Bridget had in her not to take that as a personal challenge. It would be fun to prove him wrong, but it would be best to just be a good wife. "I hope I never find one." She carried the plates to the table and poured them each a cup of coffee. He had a pot sitting out, so she assumed he drank it. "What are your plans for the day?" he asked. She shrugged. "I'll bake some bread, do the wash, and get started cleaning the house. I'm still a little tired from the journey here, but I'll do the best I can." She took a sip of her coffee. "What about you?" "Oh, we're getting close to branding, and I want to get a little bit of work done on the house before that starts. I'll give the other men their orders for the day, and I'll grab one of them, and the 2 of us will get a little more done. I want the walls up soon." "When do you think it will be done?" she asked. He frowned, immediately worried that the house they had wasn't to her liking. "As soon as I can make it happen. I'm hoping we'll spend next winter in it. I won't promise it'll be done before the snows fly, because here that could happen next week, but before winter sets in. I'm in no huge hurry. The cabin would be easier to heat in the winter, and it wouldn't be as hard to clean." Until she had his clothing mended and ready for whatever came, she had no desire to move somewhere she'd have to work harder. That's good, because late spring is the busiest time of the year for a rancher. We have to round up all the new calves, castrate the males, and brand all of them. It takes a good couple of weeks to get it all done. We'll start the roundup next week, so I have just this week to fiddle with the house a bit. He hoped she meant it that she was in no real hurry because he had a lot of work to do before he could spend any serious time on the house. Bridget shrugged. Is there anything I can do to help with all that? I could cook extra for your men? You tell me what you need, and I'll do my best to make it happen. He pursed his lips. Maybe you could bake a couple of cakes or something. I do have a cook in the bunkhouse with the men, and he keeps them filled, but they don't get a lot of variety. They'd love a good dessert. I'd be happy to. Seriously, anything. I don't mind baking, and I certainly bought what I need to bake a couple of cakes or pies or both. I would love to be a help to you. He smiled, covering her hand with his. You already fill my life with a beauty I haven't had in a very long time. He took his last couple of bites of eggs. Is it asking too much for me and the man I'll have helping me today to come here for lunch? And you cook something? Even what you cooked last night would be simply fine. I'll come up with something, she said with a smile, mentally rearranging the order in which she'd do things that day. It didn't matter though. Everything would get done. At least she didn't have to go into the post office to work. He left her with a quick kiss and headed off to his day of work. As soon as he was gone, before she even did the dishes, she hurriedly made dough. While it was rising, she got water and started it boiling for the dishes, as well as carrying in several more buckets of water to fill the wash tub for the laundry that needed to be done. By the time Felix came back with his hand for lunch, she'd gotten all the laundry on the line, baked 2 loaves of bread, and cooked bacon for sandwiches. It wasn't the best meal in the world, but she was sure the men would be happy with it. They just needed to fill their bellies to continue their workday. She put a pie in the oven as soon as she heard them stomping around outside. When the men came in, she put 3 plates on the table, the men's plates with 3 sandwiches each. Knowing Felix's appetite now, she knew they'd need that much, and she had 1 sandwich on hers. She wasn't doing the same sort of physical labor the men were. I know it's not a fancy meal, she said, but after today, I'll be able to cook extra at night for the noon meal the following day. Felix smiled. I think that's a wonderful way to do things. Bridget, this is my right-hand man, Joe Miles. Joe, this is my new wife. Joe tipped his black cowboy hat. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Potter. He took his seat at the table and reached for a sandwich. He didn't wait for a prayer, which surprised Bridget a little, but he was obviously hungry. Felix sat down and grabbed his own sandwich. The 2 men had finished all 3 of their sandwiches before Bridget was half done with hers. Maybe women's work never ended, but those men knew how precious daylight was. She could at least work after dark. After they were gone with a quick, "Thanks for lunch. Was good," from Joe, Bridget hurriedly washed the dishes again, and then started on supper. She'd planned to serve the pie as dessert with lunch, but it wasn't done baking yet. They'd eaten their meal much faster than she'd expected them to. It seemed her life would only be cooking now. There didn't seem to be a diner in town to fall back on like there was in Beckham. She'd stopped at the diner after work at least once or twice a week when her responsibilities taking care of her father and also working became too much. Her father never minded as long as he had something to eat. When she checked the clothes on the line, they were dry, so she carried them in and then took stock of Felix's clothing. He had 2 work shirts that badly needed to be mended, but she thought she could fix them. Everything else needed to be replaced. She would only be doing laundry once per week, and with the type of work he did, he'd need a different shirt for each day of the week. Even his church shirt needed mending. She couldn't imagine what the man did to tear up his clothing so badly, but she had her work cut out for her getting him to where he needed to be. There was no fabric in the house, so she set to work mending one of the shirts that could be mended. The house had been swept, but needed a much more thorough cleaning, but it seemed his shirts really did need to take precedence. His nightshirt was even torn down one side. When he returned home for the day, he came in and washed his hands. "Supper ready?" he asked. She shook her head. "I need 10 minutes to make gravy." "I didn't know what time you'd return for the day." He shrugged. "About now. I'll milk the cow and be right back." He seemed disappointed that supper wasn't ready, but he didn't complain. Bridget watched him go as she mixed flour and water to make a gravy for the potatoes she'd just finished mashing. The roast was ready. Carrots and fresh bread would finish out the meal, and she'd gotten some store-bought butter at the mercantile the day before. She noticed a churn in the corner, and though she'd never had to churn her own butter, she understood the principle. Hopefully, he wouldn't mind store-bought though. When he came back inside to wash his hands, carrying the bucket of milk, she was putting their meal on the table. "I think I put enough on there for you, but if you want more, just let me know. I'm happy to add to it." "Thank you." He sat down at the same spot he'd occupied at the table before and waited until she was seated to say a prayer over the meal. As soon as they said, "Amen," he started shoveling food into his mouth. His first plate of food was devoured before he spoke. "Busy day today. Got some done on the house, but one of the fences broke down in a storm a couple of days ago, and we just discovered it today. Spent half the day mending the fence and getting my herd back from the cauldrons. Good thing that family is honest." He watched her as she refilled his plate just as full as she had the first time. "Thanks." Bridget smiled. "I'm sorry you weren't able to carry through with your plans." He nodded. "Me too. Thankfully at their age, the calves stay with their mamas, so we were able to sort out whose cattle were whose. None of them at that age have been branded, so it would have been much harder if they hadn't been with their mothers." "That sounds like a lot of work." He wiped his mouth with the napkin she'd provided, wondering where she'd found them. He didn't remember ever having napkins. The sleeve of his shirt had always been good enough. It was. "The cauldrons helped though, so we got it done." "I'm glad," she said softly. "I made a pie for dessert for the noon meal, but you both left so quickly, I never served it. Would you like a piece?" He looked down at his empty plate. "Maybe I could have just one more helping first?" Of course. Even having seen him eat the previous day, Bridget was shocked at the sheer amount of food he was eating. "Are you always this hungry?" Felix chuckled. "I am when I've worked a full day. When we met yesterday, I hadn't worked in a week, so my appetite was downright small. Now, well, this is how I eat." She smiled. "I'll try to make a little more next time." She set a full plate in front of him, but she knew good and well she wouldn't have enough for a full meal for him at noon the next day. That was all right, though. She'd just serve him sandwiches with a roast, cover them in gravy, and add some potatoes on the side. Potatoes were easy, and she'd make sure she had enough roast and gravy left. It was obvious she'd be baking fresh bread every day, or else she'd need to get a much bigger bowl to mix up her dough in. He tucked into the third plate of food as energetically as he had the first two, and when he was finished, he leaned back on the back two legs of his chair and patted his belly. "I'm finally satisfied. Thank you for that delicious meal." She jumped up and cut them each a piece of pie she'd made with some dried apples she picked up at the market. It would have been better with fresh apples, but they weren't in season yet. He took a bite of the pie and smiled. "Absolutely delicious. I guess I got my money's worth in a cook, huh?" She blushed. "You make me feel like you bought me or something." Felix shook his head. "I'm sorry. I never meant to make you feel that way." "It's all right," she said. Bridget was starting to like the man, though she did wish he'd watch what he said a bit. He was very down to earth, and that would make things easier for them. I mended one of your work shirts today and put it in your drawer. You can wear that tomorrow. I'm going to be able to mend some more well enough that you can wear them until we have time to get some fabric, but your clothes are a mess. He nodded. Not even a surprise. He was just glad he didn't have to sort his clothing out himself any longer. No, it was best that she did that for him. Chapter 5. That evening, Felix sat and talked to Bridget as she mended another of his shirts. Do you think you'll be able to mend my dress shirt? He asked. She nodded. It's just a small tear on the seam. It should be easy to mend, and I'll have it done by Sunday morning. It would have to be replaced soon, but there was no point in telling him that. She knew her father had always been best when she only spent a little money at a time and didn't buy extra. Oh, good. I didn't want you to have to try and make me a dress shirt. She shrugged. I made several for my father over the years. He got sick about 5 years ago, and he was just wasting away. He had no appetite and he got so much smaller that I had to keep making new shirts. And he died right before you left, right? Bridget nodded, ignoring the tear that trickled down her cheek. Yes. I went to the matchmaker the night he died. Oh, that was quick. You couldn't stay for just a little while? She shook her head. No, Dad worked for the bank before he got sick, and we defaulted on the house. They let us stay until he died, but they always made it clear I'd have to leave as soon as he passed. That's terrible. I thought so, but I didn't have a choice in the matter, so I agreed. She shrugged. They already had someone who filled in for some of my shifts at the post office, and she was willing to take on more hours if I decided to no longer work there. It was easy to be on a train the day after his funeral. I didn't know you worked for the post office. Did you like it? Felix had never thought about her having a job before she came out west, but his sister had worked as a maid before she married, and his mother had to work from time to time. But what was all right for his sister and mother to do wasn't all right for his wife. Sometimes. It was a reason to get out of the house. I started doing it as soon as I finished school, to help my father out a little with the bills. I made some good friends with people who worked there as well as patrons. I don't want you working. Felix wasn't sure why he blurted that out to her, but he needed her to know she would stay home. I don't have any desire to work outside the home, she said. I'll help you in any way I can, but I'd prefer not to have to be somewhere at a certain time like I had to be back in Beckham. He smiled. Oh, good. My mother had to work for a short while because my dad was laid up with a back injury. He hated it, and I wouldn't ask that of my wife. I would work if I needed to make money for food or something. There would be no choice. But for the most part, staying home is also my preference. Good. We'll fight over that if I'm ever hurt or something. Or if he dies. Bridget knew better than anyone that people died young and unexpectedly. All right. As they talked, he got a much better picture of how difficult her life had been in Beckham, and he was very thankful she was the one who had responded to his letter. She not only knew how to work, but she was beautiful. How he'd found someone who fit in his life so well, he wasn't sure. Of course, if she'd just agreed to consummating the marriage, she would be absolutely perfect. He once again went for a walk as she readied for bed, but this time she was still awake when he came back inside. He turned down the lantern, undressing in the dark, and got into bed with her. She knew his nightshirt was being mended, so she didn't want to know what he was wearing as he climbed between the sheets. She lay there on her back for a bit, staring at the ceiling, feeling awkward and uncertain. Bridget? Yes? Are you still awake? He asked unnecessarily. I am. It's dark in here. It is. She had no idea what he wanted from her. Is it okay if I kiss you goodnight? He asked. Of course. Bridget turned on her side, facing him. You don't have to always ask. I didn't know if you were sleeping. You fell asleep really fast last night. Only because I slept so little on the train. She'd eaten very little as well. She hadn't wanted to use the money he'd sent her for her expenses along the way. Oh. You don't usually fall asleep so fast? Almost never. He reached out and stroked her cheek, cupping the side of her face with the palm of his hand. I'm glad you're here, he whispered just before his lips met hers. His kiss was soft, but after a moment, it deepened, and he moved his hand from her cheek to the nape of her neck, under the braid she'd put her hair in so it wouldn't tangle too badly in her sleep. Bridget didn't know what to do with her hands, and finally she put the hand she wasn't lying on onto his shoulder. It was as bare as she'd imagined it would be. She was in bed with a naked man. For a moment, she felt a bit of horror, but then she gave herself over to the kiss, moving a bit closer to him on the bed, but making certain not to let their bodies touch too much. After he broke the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers. How does one day sound? He asked. It took her a minute to realize what he was talking about. He wanted to make love now, and not wait another 4 days. I think we need to stick to our original agreement of 5 days. He sighed. All right. He immediately rolled away from her, saying something under his breath. She could only catch the words shrivel up and fall off. Did you say something? She asked, knowing full well he had. Nothing that was meant for your ears. He laid on his back, staring at the ceiling, wishing his ardor would go away as quickly as hers apparently did. Why didn't she want him like he wanted her? Asterisk. The following day went much like their first full day of marriage. Felix was gone most of the day, and he brought Joe home for the noon meal again. Thankfully, Bridget was able to stretch the small amount of leftovers from the night before, and she planned a much larger meal for supper that night. She was able to give her new home a more thorough cleaning that day, and she hoped that Felix would give her the driving lesson soon. Bridget needed to be able to get into town to purchase the fabric she needed as well as more food. She'd underestimated the amount Felix would eat. She had just pulled a cake out of the oven for dessert that night when there was a knock on the door. She opened it, unsure who would come to visit. To Bridget's surprise, there was a woman close to her age standing at the door, a pie in one hand and 2 boys right beside her. Come in, Bridget said, hoping this person would be her first friend in Montana. Hello. I just wanted to welcome you to Cauldron Valley. I'm Maisie Cauldron, and these are my boys, Alex and Ray. Maisie handed the pie to Bridget immediately. I didn't want to come, and do not have anything sweet to offer. I know you just arrived, but many women would be mortified. I just baked a cake, so I'll let the boys choose. Your mama's pie or my cake? Mama's pie, Alex yelled. Ray nodded. I'm serving pie, Bridget said with a smile. I'm Bridget Potter. It's good to meet you. Felix has been talking about having sent off for a mail-order bride to anyone who would listen, so I'm glad you're finally here. I was sure the man would burst if he had to wait another day. Mrs. Cauldron shook her head with a laugh. Bridget laughed. Sit down, and I'll get tea for you. Do the boys like tea, or would they prefer milk? Milk, Alex yelled again. Wondering if the boy ever spoke below a yell, Bridget smiled. I'll get milk. The boys looked to be the same age, but they weren't identical. Are they twins? Mrs. Cauldron nodded. It's the curse of the Cauldron family to always have twin boys. There are never any girls. Oh, that's sad. I think it would be worse if there were triplet boys. Twins seem normal to me. I grew up here in Cauldron Valley, and everyone knows twins are normal for their family. But if they had triplets, I think that would be very unlucky. Oh, dear, Bridget said, grinning at her guest. I'm so happy you came by. I was just doing some housework, and I was about to start mending some of Felix's shirts. I could use a nice visit. We can't stay long, but I wanted to meet you. According to Felix, you're simply perfect. Bridget frowned, drawing her brows together. When did you talk to him about me? Oh, before you ever came. Mrs. Caldron smiled. I haven't seen him since you got here. He didn't know my name or anything about me before I arrived on Monday afternoon. He had dreams, Mrs. Caldron said, laughing softly. Bridget set 2 pieces of pie and glasses of milk in front of the boys, waiting for the water to heat up for the tea. He had an imagination, you mean, Bridget shook her head. Felix truly was a character. He's a good man, Mrs. Caldron said. I hope you realize what a kind man you've married. It almost seemed that Mrs. Caldron was trying to sell her on her husband, which was completely unnecessary. Bridget smiled, nodding. I do. But it was so good to hear someone else's opinion of Felix. She'd worried she was married to a man who wasn't well respected in the area. Good. I live just down the road, not even a mile. The boys and I walked over because the day is so beautiful, and we like to walk off our energy in the afternoons, don't we, boys? And we like pie. Alex yelled. I like pie too, Bridget told the boy. How long have you and Mr. Caldron been married? Mrs. Caldron smiled. 6 years. The boys are 5. I used to let them nap in the afternoons, but I found I was doing myself a disservice. If we walk instead, they're much more tuckered out at night, and we don't have to get up 53 times for water or another story before they'll sleep. Bridget laughed. They seem like good boys. Loud, but good. They are. But if you find someone playing pranks, and I find out it's them, they will feel my wrath. Looking between the boys and their mother, Bridget had to wonder what had happened, but she didn't dare ask. She poured 2 cups of tea and put both on the table with 2 more slices of pie. Do you take milk or sugar? She asked. Both, if you don't mind. I guess I like my tea light and sweet. I do as well, Bridget said, bringing milk and sugar to the table. Mrs. Caldron smiled. Tell me about yourself. Where are you from? Until a couple of weeks ago, I've spent my entire life in Beckham, Massachusetts, which is about an hour south of Boston. I loved it there. Bridget smiled sadly. My father passed away, and I no longer had any reason to stay with no family left, so I went to my friend, who is a matchmaker, and she showed me Felix's letter. I left on a train the morning after his funeral. I'm so sorry for your loss. I lost my father last year, and I don't think it matters how old you are. Losing a parent is so hard. The only thing I can think of that would be harder is losing a husband or a child. Bridget knew in that moment she'd not only made her first friend in Montana, but she'd made a friend for life. Thank you. I needed someone to say those words to me. After the pie had been eaten, Mrs. Caldron and her twin sons went to the door. Please feel free to visit any time, Mrs. Caldron said as she gave Bridget a quick hug. I would love to have you come by. And any time you and the boys need to take a break while you're on your walk, I'll be here. Thank you so much for visiting. It meant a lot to me. It's hard when you don't know anyone. I told you I was raised here, but I tend to spend most of my time with my sister-in-law, Iris. Our husbands are twins, of course, and we all live at the Caldron Ranch. I'm sure it's nice to be part of a large family. Most of the time, Mrs. Caldron said, nodding at the boys as they ran ahead of her. Sometimes it just makes me tired. She waved as she headed on her way, and Bridget watched her go. It felt good to have a friend, and now she'd have something to tell Felix about her day. As soon as her new friend was out of sight, Bridget did the few dishes their impromptu tea party had spawned before putting a chicken into the oven to bake. She'd make mashed potatoes, gravy, and green beans to go with it. So far, Felix hadn't seemed to be pleased with the vegetables she'd added to the meals, but he'd eaten them, and that seemed healthy to her. Sitting down to finish mending Felix's nightshirt, she thought about how lovely it had been to receive a visitor. Perhaps she would go by the Cauldron Ranch this week and return the favor. She'd certainly enjoy meeting the other Cauldrons and getting to know Maisie. This time when Felix came home from a hard day of work, she had his meal ready for him, and there were even 2 desserts for him to choose from, and she could top either of them with the whipped cream she'd made. He smiled when he saw the food on the table. "Thank you for having it ready for me. As long as I know what time you'll be home, I'll always try to have it on the table." He kissed her cheek quickly and then sat down, saying the prayer quickly, before devoting himself to eating. Watching him, Bridget knew she would be in the kitchen more than out of it, but that was all right with her. Felix was worth it.